So, very excited to bring you guys my Thorns Barbarian build. Build is still very much a work in progress, but it is the build I'm planning to run for Season 1 as my starter build, my starter character. And I don't even have Razor Plate yet, so the footage you see in the background, I only have about half of the Thorns damage I should have if I had Razor Plate. But despite that, even in content up to 20 levels above my level, I'm having no issues at all. The build is absolutely stopping, doing tons of damage. It feels amazing, tons of movement speed thanks to always being Berserking, Lunging Strike as well. Feels great all around. Nothing more entertaining than you just seeing an elite just splash themselves on me and just immediately implode, right? Very satisfying, tons of fun to play. And again, unless the Season 1 patch notes sway me to something else, this is going to be my League Start character because, like I said, the background footage you see with, behind you, or in the background, I guess, is without Razor Plate. So, Thorns Barbarian, surprisingly not as reliant on Razor Plate as I was expecting. So let's go and get into it. We're going to start with a quick gameplay breakdown. I'm going to explain how everything works. To win, stuff like that. Let's get into it. So I'm going to be going over the ins and outs of the build in this section. All the things you need to know to make it work, how it ticks. So let's go ahead and get into it. First of all, is a Thorns build, you might expect that to mean this is very, very simple. And there's just very few things you can do for it. But surprisingly, Thorns has a lot of ways you can scale its damage. First, and the biggest one is going to be vulnerable damage. The enemies are vulnerable, they will take more damage from Thorns depending on your vulnerable damage, right? And then any source of generic damage is going to be stuff like damage while berserking, damage while fortified, any sort of generic like damage to bleeding, damage to crowd controlled, anything like that. And those are going to be our main ways of stacking this, our damage on this build. Obviously just any source of vulnerable will do for that, but the way we're going to get our other sources of damage are going to be two, or I guess three primary things. First, Berserk. We're going to be focused on having Berserk up basically 100% of the time on this build, and this is going to be primarily facilitated with double swing. This essentially just extends your Berserk by 2 seconds. This is very, very good, and with this you can easily have your Berserker up 100% of the time while you are fighting in, right? Very good. You will always have Berserk active. Next is going to be Fortify. This but is another way to generate Fortify. We'll get into that later. And finally is damage, bleeding enemies. And we are going to do a number of things to get bleeding on this build. One is going to be this aspect that while berserking, you do bleed damage, right? Bleed damage. Also, taking advantage of the passive that makes enemies take an additional 10% of their Thorns damage as bleeding for 5 seconds. Like this. If you hit the enemy, they will be bleeding. They will be bleeding, right? Either way, as the enemy interacts with you in a way that involves damage, they will be bleeding. So you have very, very, basically 100% of time on bleeding as well, right? And those are going to be your main ways of stacking your damage. So keep that in mind, that if you're not berserking, you're missing out on damage. If you're not fortified, you're missing out on damage. If the enemy isn't bleeding, you are missing out on damage. And of course, as the enemy isn't vulnerable, you are missing out on damage. So you kind of need those things to all line up, right? And it isn't really that difficult. Now let's go ahead and get into the rest of the skills, and we'll explain kind of what place everything has. We'll kind of first talk about the centerpiece of this build, Steel Grasp. Now, this build is really, really, really good for our build, really good for Thorns and what we want it for. So if you've never seen the skill before, throws out some chains. It will hit enemies and drag them to you, and it does a number of things for us. One, it makes enemies vulnerable, and it gives us 2 seconds of berserking. This is a really nice way to get your berserk started, or you extend it with double strike, right? And again, this skill drags enemies to you. This is the Thorns build. You need enemies to hit you. Steel Grasp will drag them to you. They will almost always just attack you right away. They'll take their Thorns damage, and because we will be taking advantage of the Thorns explosion aspect, you will do a ton of AoE damage when you take advantage of this. So Steel Grasp, a very, very, very good skill for our build. On a pretty short cooldown, 9 seconds, and it has 2 charges. Very good. It's kind of hard to really justify dropping this for something else. It's just really good. Now, the basic skill for this is going to be Lunging Strike, but I will say you could also use Flay here if you really, really want. And honestly, both are pretty good. Flay has the advantage of giving you extra Thorns and a little bit of damage reduction, but personally, I just felt that Lunging Strike felt way, 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 way better, right? Way more mobility, and you have a little bit of extra berserking on crit strikes from lunging strike, right? It's very good. Feels amazing, but if you want, you can use Flay. Both are fine, right? Both are fine. But I personally prefer Lightning Strike. Now, your main non-Thorns source of damage on this build is going to be Double Swing. Now, again, the main purpose of Double Swing is to get our Berserk up 100% of the time, of course, but it does actually still do decent damage, especially if you get some, skill ranks on your gear for this. It does quite a bit. And another nice thing about this is that, if you stun a boss, for example, well, it's not going to be attacking you. Double Swing will just let you sit there and just spam Double Swing the whole time, because it does generate 25 Fury, which is the space cost, by the way, when you hit a stunned enemy. So if you stun a boss, you can just sit there, or if someone else stuns a boss, you can just sit there and spam Double Swing, and you won't be losing out on as much DPS, right? And those are your prime, and of course those are your damage skills. Now moving on into our defensive skills, we have 3 of them. We have 2 sources of Unstoppable on this build to kind of make sure you rotate out Iron Skin and Rallying Cry for this. But again, Rallying Cry, of course, 2 main sort of things here: Unstoppable and Fortified Generation. This is really nice to get your initial Fortified stack started, and it's kind of one of the big reasons I'm using it on this build. It's just to get my Fortified started, my Fortified Generation, that is. And it's also really nice to have the bit of movement speed, especially a lot of times after I've started, got my Fury or Fortify up, I will use Rallying Cry to run from one pack of monsters to the next, because 30% move speed is pretty big. Moving on, next is Challenging Shout. Again, this taunts the enemies, and it gives us a ton of damage reduction, 40%. So tanky while you use this, especially since you also get more max life, 20% bonus max life, and you also get a bunch more Thorns. This is just an amazing defensive skill, and it does also taunt enemies and drag them to you. Make them run at you, make them attack you. Very, very good for the build. No way you can not run this, pretty much, in my opinion. And finally, it is Iron Skin. This is essentially your get out of jail free card, especially while with taking advantage of this aspect of the Iron Warrior. Iron Skin gives you Unstoppable and a good chunk of damage reduction, 23 to 38% on the amulet, which is where I would recommend having it. So potentially nearly 40% damage reduction, just like on Challenging Shout. Very, very, very strong. You basically pop this, you get barrier, you get life regen, get Unstoppable. You are just unkillable. This is great, right? This is your get out of jail free. And that's finally it for the gameplay breakdown. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the gear. Now, let's talk about the most important stats for the build first. And first of all, is going to be, of course, vulnerable damages as your primary damage multiplier, where all your damage comes from, essentially. But next, I do want to talk about critical strike chance and critical strike damage. Now, you might be wondering why I bother with this at all, because this is a Thorns build. Thorns cannot crit, right? Well, first of all, I just want to advise you to give up on the idea of a purely Thorns build. Just give up on that. That's just the way it is, right? Now, the reason you want to build for critical strike chance, you notice I don't actually have much built for crit damage. All the, the extra like 52.5% actually just comes from the implicits on my swords. I have no critical damage on the suffixes of my gear, but I am running emeralds, which gives me critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, of course. But again, don't sleep on the DPS that comes from Double Swing on this build. It actually hits pretty hard. Don't underestimate it, but also you get a really, really nice quality of life bonus from critical strikes and lunging strike, right? Get your Berserk. This is another nice way to maintain your Berserk if I had this man Double Swing all the time. Otherwise, way would get your Berserk started. But again, don't underestimate how much damage Double Swing can do, right? Don't sleep on it. Now, that said, other than that, damage to bleeding enemies, damage to close enemies, all these things are good. Damage while berserking is good. All those things are pretty good, right? So let's go ahead and get into the weapon types. Now, obviously, you have to use a mace, but 2 swords and polearm are going to be my recommended weapons of choice here. In the substats of all of these, I would recommend for strength, vulnerable damage, and then 2 more generic damage modifiers that benefit this build. Damage to berserking and damage to bleeding ones are probably the best, most consistent options, but there's also things like damage to close enemies, damage to slowed enemies. That doesn't work on bosses, but But basically, this is the role you're looking for. This polearm. This is what you're looking for, basically, right? Now, the reason I use a polearm here for the two-handed slashing weapon is, one, injured is better than damage to healthy, in my opinion. It's just got a bigger window, right? You know, healthy is 80% plus, injured is 35% and below. Just got a bigger window. It's also just nicer to have that finishing power, right? But the reason I don't recommend using the sword here is just because I want more damage on my thorns. And I don't think it's worth investing that much more damage on critical strike damage that the two-handed sword would have. Now, if you want to have more damage on double swing, you could run a two-handed sword instead. Either one is perfectly fine. Now, I do want to mention that on this build, I am only using dual wield. I'm going for max attack speed on this build. Now, you could do differently, but basically, the mace and the polearm are early stat sticks. You only care about the substats on these. The actual, item power doesn't really matter that much, especially once you get 725 and above. That's the final break point for substats. Item power doesn't matter at all for these two weapons, right? Only care about the substats. Now, one other thing I want to talk about is why use strength here, right? You might be wondering why use strength when I could get, better damage elsewhere. Well, first of all, the main reason is no matter how much of this additive, basic damage you stack, not going to be that huge of a bonus compared to the vulnerable damage, right? And strength has the very nice benefit of also giving armor, right? So strength is just a really nice, combined damage and survivability stat for Barbarian. So I felt it was worth going for strength, any other kind of just like generic damage modifier here. Now, you could go for something else, but in my opinion, go for strength. Now, moving on to jewelry. Now, this is a big, place in the build, is still work in progress. I haven't really settled down on what I want here. I would recommend Ranks of No Mercy on the amulet, and then damage reduction and percent strength would be my recommendations. Damage reduction from close, damage reduction from distance. So damage reduction from close, damage reduction from distance, percent strength, and Ranks of No Mercy is kind of like the perfect role I'm looking for on this build. If you don't know what No Mercy is, this is going to be passive skill that gives you 3% critical strike chance for immobilized, stunned, or slowed. Keep in mind that your bleed effects do slow. And that's why I'm going for that. Just for extra crit chance. Very good. It's very comfy. And the damage reduction. Now, for the rings, max life, critical strike chance, vulnerable damage are, kind of like a really easy, just always go for those three. And the final one, just damage, I guess. Any damage to berserking, damage to bleeding, damage to close, anything works there pretty much. And then you want to put armor or skulls into the jewelry sockets, right? Although I suppose in season 1 you'll put the new seasonal gems here, so I guess you can actually ignore that. And moving on to the rest of the armor, first for the helmet, Ranks of Steel Grasp is like kind of the easy pick here with some max life, strength, and total armor. It's kind of the role I've decided to stick with for the helmet. If you want to look for some other stats on the helmet, that's fine. Total armor, probably not that necessary for the build. You already have so much. The razor plate should go here. I have this on because it dropped. It's got thorns on it. I'm basically just using it as filler until I get razor plate, right? But this should be razor plate. Other than that, moving to the gloves, attack speed, crit chance, ranks of double swing, and strength is, I think, going to be pretty much the perfect role on this build. For the leggings, you're really looking for thorns, maybe max life, and then damage reduction. And personally, it's kind of hard to choose what to go for here. There's actually a lot of ways you could go for your legs. You could go full damage reduction. You could go for 4 damage percent reduction lines here with maybe a max life or percent armor. But I'm probably looking at, for my end game setup for this, is probably going to be double damage reduction from close specifically, and maybe even just stick with damage reduction from fortify. But I was thinking maybe also damage reduction from distant. But then thorns, you get a lot of thorns, and max life. This build does need a lot of HP in order to face tank, so kind of need more max life than a lot of builds. And then finally for the boots, movement speed, of course, and then just damage reduction, right? Pretty simple overall. And that's going to be pretty much it for the gear. So now let's go ahead and talk about the legendary aspects. Just keep in mind that the legendary aspects is also a work in progress. So first of all, two things to keep in mind. One, this is still very much a work in progress build, and there is one specific change I'm still kind of experimenting with and testing and deciding if I want to make. And that season 1 is coming up very, very soon. And with season 1, there are new aspects being released, which might switch up what you want to put on this build. Just keep that in mind. But now let's talk about that one change I'm still kind of debating myself with. And so my helmet here, I'm running the Steadfast Berserker's aspect. This gives me Fortify when I deal damage while berserking, right? And this is currently my primary source of Fortify, but it does kind of lock me out from using Aspect of Disobedience, which would be a huge increase in survivability on this build. And the way I'm considering getting away with running or not running the Fortify aspect, the whatever it's called, is instead using the Warbringer board here, the Warbringer Paragon board, and using the Warbringer legendary node as my primary source of Fortify generation, of course outside of Rallying Cry. But my consistent source of Fortify generation. Now that said, I don't know how good that's actually going to feel. It was very much kind of up in the air as to if that's going to feel good or not. But without that, I can't afford to fit Aspect of Disobedience in this build, even though it would be a massive boost in survivability. So you can make that decision for yourself. But first, I want to get into the offensive aspects. So first, let's talk about the mandatory aspects first. So first of all, there's going to be this one, for example, the Death Wish aspect, which gives you a bunch of thorns while berserking. This is in the codex. Put it on your two-handed weapon. It gets doubled. It's a ton of thorns, and is just a ton of free damage for you. Now the other one is the Needle Flare aspect. This aspect makes it so whenever your thorns goes off, there's a % chance that it instead, does an AoE explosion around you for the thorns damage, right? And these are kind of the two mandatory aspects, and they are both in the codex, right? Now let's get into some of the other stuff. First of all, the other aspect into my other two-handed weapon is the Edgemaster's aspect. However, keep in mind that the Edgemaster's does not affect Thorns damage. Purely for double swing damage, does not affect Thorns at all. So if you want to run something else here instead and focus more on Thorns damage, feel free to do so. Now, my other weapons, I've got the Rapid aspect on one of my swords, or just more, attack speed on my lunging strike, get around faster, generate fury faster, And then on my other one, I've got Aspect of Berserk Ripping. Gives me bleeding, or I deal extra bleeding damage while I'm berserking. Primary purpose of this aspect is purely to be able to apply bleed to, say, for example, a boss that doesn't actually attack you, or something that's stunned. Just to make sure I can always apply bleed, and I can always benefit from anything that affects damage to bleeding enemies, stuff like that, right? That's primary purpose for this aspect. If you're not too worried about that, you can replace this with something else. Entirely up to you. Now, going over the aspect in the jewelry, the first is going to be Aspect of the Iron Warrior on the amulet. This is to give you unstoppable during your iron skin and a bunch of damage reduction, which does get increased by 50% while it's on your amulet, of course, the aspect that is. Very, very, very good. Definitely put that on your amulet. On my other ring, I've got the Accelerating aspect on one of my rings. This is purely for extra DS with double swing. Entirely up to you. You can drop this if you want for something else. Doesn't really matter. And then I've also got Aspect of the Umbral. Now, at the basic roll that you get from the codex, the one primary resource for crowd control isn't very useful at all. But at 3 or 4, this is very good because remember, on this build, every time you apply Thorns, you apply Bleed, which applies Slow. That means every time you apply Thorns, you get however much Fury, 1 to 4 Fury, every time your Thorns procs, right? And it doesn't matter if the enemy is already slowed, you'll get the Fury regardless, right? So this can be an amazing way to generate all the Fury you could ever need. And another good option for the rings here is, I don't remember what it's called, but it's the aspect that gives you, or that reduces your shout's cooldowns based on the number of enemies affected by it up to a total of 6 seconds. It's just a really, really nice way to reduce your shout cooldowns, and honestly works well in either ring here. You could replace either of these aspects with that, although I'd probably lean towards replacing the accelerating aspect personally. Now, that said, getting into the other defensive gear, first of all, for the chest, you are going to want to run Razor Blade here. Now, for the legs, aspect of might, 20% damage reduction, very, very, very good, of course. Kind of really hard to pass up. You're spamming Lightning Strike all the time as well, so you're always going to have this up, basically. And finally, in the legs, this is another one's kind of up to you. You already have 2 sources of Unstoppable on this build. We are, of course, running the eluding aspect. That makes it so you get Unstoppable while injured. If you're crowd control and you become injured, you get 4 seconds of Unstoppable. This is up to you. Again, the build does have 2 very good sources of Unstoppable already. But personally, I just really like eluding. It's such a nice get out of jail free card for if you make a mistake or you accidentally waste your cooldown, something like that, right? It's just so nice. But if you want to run something else here, you can, right? Entirely up to you. And that's going to about do it for the legendary aspects. Just keep in mind that if anything new, relating, anything Thorns related comes out for the in season 1, you're probably going to want to end up with that. But that's going to be it for the legendary aspects. Let's go ahead and get into the Paragon board. Now keep in mind, this is very much still a work in progress. I'm still kind of experimenting with things and tweaking things, and I'll go over some of the things I'm thinking about as I go through the skill tree. But first, let's talk about the basic skills. There's going to be 2 real options here between Lightning Strike and Flay. But for these options, I've opted for Lightning Strike, and I'll get into why in just a moment. But first of all, if you're going to run Flay, take it out to enhance for the extra health generation, and to combat Lunging Strike for the Berserk generation as well. And this is really nice. You get 1.5 seconds Berserk whenever you crit. Nice way to get your Berserk started when you first engage a group of enemies, or just have some extra Berserk generation, right? The life generation is there. It's not particularly that great, but it is a little bit of extra sustain. But most importantly, Lunging Strike is a very nice mobility tool in the battlefield. Jumps you from enemy to enemy. Really nice. And moving on to Flay, would want to, of course, take this out to enhance for the vulnerable application, and to combat Flay with the damage reduction and the Thorns stacks. Now, this might immediately seem like the far better option, and perhaps in terms of what it actually provides you in terms of stats and whatnot, Flay is way better. But personally, I just found that Lunging Strike felt so much better to play that it was worth giving up the extra damage reduction, and it is up to 12% damage reduction, and at my level 77, over 1200 Thorns, I found it was worth giving that up to the extra mobility that Lightning Strike provides. It's just so much better to play with Lightning Strike. As a personal preference, perhaps if I had more movement speed, say like 160% plus, like at the minimum, I would say, Flay may feel better, but for now, Lightning Strike just feels way too much better to not run. And moving on to core skills, 5 points in Double Swing. Take it out to enhanced for the Fury generation on stunned enemies. This is really nice for mainly bosses if you stun them. Nice way to keep your DPS up while you aren't applying Thorns from, or while they aren't activating Thorns, right? And then take it out to Furious Double Swing. This is kind of a cornerstone of the build. This is your primary method of sustaining your Berserk. Really nice. Keep in mind that the extra ranks on Double Swing do provide quite a bit of the damage here. Without the extra 4 ranks from my item, it's only 56% of your base damage, compared just to the 72% that I have. Fine. Now moving on out. Oh, pressure point. Almost forgot. Pressure point here. 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable. Seconds. Very good. Very nice. Now moving on to defensive skills. First is going to be Rallying Cry. Get out to enhance Rallying Cry for the Unstoppable, and to Strategic for the Fortify generation. This is going to be your primary method of getting your Fortify stack started, and also an Unstoppable tool, right? Moving on to Iron Skin. Keep in mind that you should be running the aspect for this that gives you damage reduction and Unstoppable on this. So it gives you Unstoppable, it gives you a barrier based on your missing max life. Now, taking it out to enhance, you get extra barrier based on your maximum life. And then to Tactical Iron Skin for the life sustained. This is actually a lot more healing than it seems like. Keep in mind that 10% of the barrier's original amount is life per second. That's 10% every second, not 10% total. And then it just feels way better than strategic in my opinion. Now moving on to challenging shout. Big source of damage reduction here. Also taunts. Enemies will aggro onto you a bit more aggressively. Then take that out to enhance for the extra maximum life while it's active. That's a lot of max life, by the way. And then to challenging shout for extra thorns based on your max life. Very good. Tons of extra thorns. Tons of damage reduction. Very, very, very strong. Now for your passives here, 3-point imposing presence for 15% additional max life. 3 points in martial vigor for 9% more damage reduction against elites. 1 point in outburst. I just found the extra thorns from this passive 4 points just was not worth it, especially that bonus maximum, or thorns for both bonus maximum life might seem really good at first, but it's actually not that much. Fortunately, it's just not very good. And then 3 points in tough as nails for 9% more thorns, and then of course also the bleeding application from your thorns as well. Moving on to the brawling skills, nothing but passives here. 3 points in aggressive resistance for sure. 9% damage reduction while berserking, obviously very good. 3 points in prolific fury, very much up for debate. Something I'm strongly considering dropping actually and putting those points elsewhere. Don't feel like it's necessary. 3 points in swiftness for the extra move speed. This is going to be a personal preference thing. I prefer the move speed just from moving between pack to pack, of course. Very nice quality of life right there, but keep it up to yourself. Now, obviously, if you're running Flay, almost certainly worth running for the extra movement speed to get to enemies faster. But for Lightning Strike, a little bit more questionable. Now, moving on to Weapon Mastery, of course, at least 1 point in Steel Grasp. I've got 2 points in mine. What I had left over points-wise. Take that out to enhance Steel Grasp for the vulnerable application, and to Fighter's Steel Grasp for the Berserk generation as well. This is a very nice clumping tool. Makes enemies vulnerable, and it gives you Berserk. And it's got 2 charges, and it's got a pretty short cooldown. Feels great. Keep in mind, more ranks to Steel Grasp does increase or decrease the cooldown. Very good. Now for passives here, 1 point in Hamstring. This is just to get your slow application, to get that, that crowd control. Technical application, even though it's not very much. Don't really need more than this. Obviously cut to the bone. We don't actually do much bleeding damage on the build, so it's not worth it. 1 point in Pit Fighter. Honestly, could be worth running more points in this if you want to move points from elsewhere. But take this out to No Mercy. 3 points in No Mercy for base 9% more crit chance, up to 18% with my bonus 3 ranks. Tons of extra crit chance for your double swing and your lunging strike. Now 1 point in Thick Skin. Also another passive possibly worth running more points in. I didn't find it was worth it, just not quite enough fortified generation to justify the extra points, in my opinion. Mostly to get out to defensive stance, 6% more damage reduction while fortified, and then counter offensive, more damage while fortified, 12% multiplier at max rank, 3 ranks. Very, very good. Nothing on the ultimate skill tree here. Now, Duelist, 3 points in this could be pretty good. Again, if you want to drop points here or 8 points there. Duelist would probably be one of my top considerations for running more points. And then finally, for the key passive, it is going to be Unconstrained. This is obviously a Berserk build to some extent. Obviously we build a lot around Berserk. 5% more maximum duration of Berserk. That takes it up to 10 seconds total. And extra Berserk damage bonus. Really good. And nothing else really benefits the build too much. Obviously we don't really do that much bleed damage, so for gushing wounds. Walking Arsenal. Don't even run enough of damage skills on the build to activate all 3 things of this. And then Unbridled Rage. I mean, just not very good for the build. We need that Berserk uptime, so we need to be able to spam double swing, and if it costed 100% more fury, it would be unreasonable to maintain the Berserk. So yeah, Unconstrained, the only real good option here, and it is a really good option here. So, and that's it for the skill tree. Again, lots of wiggle room here, honestly, especially mostly these 3 points right here. You can kind of really do whatever you want with these. Put them wherever you want. But yeah, that's going to be it for the skill tree. So So now let's go ahead and get into the Paragon board. So before you start a board, first just kind of head up the right, get that damage up, get the glyph socket. In this glyph socket, I'm putting the blood feed glyph, a little bit of extra crit chance, and damage to bleeding enemies. Of course, this is good for our build. Enemies are always bleeding. And up through the left path from damage. And then the second board, I guess the first board you want to attach is going to be the Blood Rage board. And then just sort of make sure it's in alignment where the glyph is in the bottom right of the board. And just sort of path along the bottom right wall of the board. Head out, get the glyph, necessary sockets you need. And for this glyph, it is the Ire glyph, damage while berserking, and damage reduction from elites while berserking. Very good. Tons of damage reduction, and a good chunk of damage as well. And finally go up to the right gate of the board. For this board, you're going to want to run the Decimator board. Kind of just head straight through the center here. Go down a little bit, and go create it, and go straight across to the glyph. For this glyph, you're going to want the Undaunted glyph. More damage reduction while fortified, and damage while fortified as well. Make sure you get these extra nodes here for damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, and the extra vulnerable damage, because that is our primary damage multiplier, right? And then go straight across to the right, and then attach the next board, which is going to be the Hemorrhage board. For this one, make sure the glyph is in the bottom left, and just kind of go down here at these damage reduction nodes. Glyph, which is going to be the Exploit glyph. Obviously, vulnerable damage is good for us, but more importantly, this gives us another nice, easy way to apply vulnerable without having to grasp. Very nice. Greatly improves the quality of life of the build. And just sort of kind of head down to the bottom gate of the board, and then run the Carnage board here. So this one just goes straight down to the glyph, and then we're going to want to run the Territorial glyph here. Keep in mind that Territorial will need to be level 15 before you can get enough dexterity to get the bonus on it, the damage reduction from close enemies. This is going to be more damage reduction and more damage. Very, very nice. Then make sure you get these damage while berserking nodes and these damage reduction from close enemies. Well, once you've got that, head out to the left gate and attach the Warbringer board. Take this path right here, kind of just come straight out to these damage while fortified nodes. Get these damage while fortified, magic nodes and the rare node. And then come out and get the legendary Warbringer node. Now, I want to go and say this last bit is kind of optional. This is just what I'm planning to do. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. And once you're done with that, you can kind of just do whatever you want with your remaining points. You can fill out more stats because, once you've got your glyphs level 15, you'll have more things you can stats from on these, for the glyphs, of course. So if you want to get more stats on your glyphs, you can do that. If you want to try to get some legendary nodes, Hemorrhage is probably a pretty decent one for the build. Maybe Carnage, kind of decent. Unfortunately, Decimator not very useful, and also Blood Rage not useful. Just that Berserk generation, because we already have basically 100% Berserk uptime. Unfortunately, not a lot of super good options among the legendary nodes for a Thorns build. That's going to be pretty much it for the Paragon board. As always, for the video, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if you've got any questions, any thoughts, any kind of suggestions you'd like to make, because again, this build is a work in progress. If you got any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. But that's going to be it for this video. I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, take it easy and have a good one, everybody.